Chapter 1, The Glass Monolith. At sunset, the Synapse Tower looked less like a building than a blade planted in the throat of the sky. Its mirrored sides knifed upward from the cluttered strata of Neo-San Francisco, emerging from the haze of carbon scrubbers and drone lanes until the city fell away. Distant, abstract. Up here, the air thinned and cooled. Traffic became a faint, insectile buzz under the constant sigh of wind against glass. The tower's upper levels were sheathed in an electrochromic skin that shifted tint with the sun, absorbing glare, dispersing heat, transforming harsh light into a muted, painterly glow. From street level, the effect had earned it 100 nicknames in a dozen languages: the Ice Spike, the Ghost Spire, the Monolith. Synapse's branding called it the Thorne, after the man who'd built the company and claimed the sky. Inside the penthouse, sound dissolved before it had a chance to echo. The floor was a continuous plane of white glass, matte underfoot, warm to the touch from radiant threads woven just beneath the surface. Walls were more suggestion than barrier, wide expanses of transparent polymer, broken only by thin structural ribs, so fine they looked like pencil lines drawn between floor and ceiling. Furniture existed as interruptions rather than occupants. A low slate rectangle that somehow functioned as a table, 2 black chairs in an L facing the city, a slender console that floated from the wall like an altar. Marcus Vane had always hated this room, not because it was ugly, there was nothing ugly in Elias Thorne's world, but because it had the disorienting perfection of a simulation. No mess, no stray cup or charging cable, nothing that suggested a human being had ever slouched here in flawed, bodily discomfort. Everything had been curated, down to the exact thermal gradient between the glass under his Italian Oxfords and the air against his immaculately pressed cuffs. He stood near the far window, hands in his pockets, watching the light bleed out of the city. Below, Neo-San Francisco pulsed, grid lines of traffic, swarms of delivery drones weaving between tower clusters, the dim auroras of AR overlays painting the air above plazas and transit hubs. The bay was a dark sheet broken by the white scars of ferry wakes and the hulking silhouettes of cargo platforms. Out on the water, 2 wind and wave farms glowed with maintenance LEDs, blurred by the brownish veil of the lower atmosphere. It could have been beautiful, Marcus thought. Once it might have been, but Synapse had taught him how to see differently. Every flicker of light was a device ping. Every drone's flight path was a line item in a logistics dashboard. Every cluster of pedestrians was a heat map cell, an opportunity for engagement, persuasion, monetization, points on a grid, nothing more. Behind him, the soft churn of the penthouse's environmental system deepened for a moment, compensating for the slight heat signature of the elevator car approaching. Marcus checked his reflection in the window. Dark hair swept back, the first threads of gray at his temples, tailored indigo suit absorbing the last of the day. He blinked twice, dismissing the subtle AR prompts at the edge of his vision. The meeting notes, budget summaries, Helena Park's latest impatient message. He didn't need them for this conversation. The elevator doors opened with a whisper, releasing a small plume of cooler, denser air. "Marcus," Elias said, his voice even run through the lab-quiet acoustics that softened every consonant, still carried that crisp, lightly amused cadence. It was the sound of keynote stages and product films, polished yet somehow intimate. People all over the world had listened to that voice tell them what they already wanted. They'd believed him when he said the future would be simple, graceful, kind. Elias Thorne stepped out of the elevator, alone. That was unusual. No assistants with slates, no security in discreet smart fabric suits. Just the founder of Synapse Technologies, worth more on paper than several mid-sized nations, moving without entourage through his own sanctum as if it were an extension of his body. The last time Marcus had seen Elias in person, 4 months ago at an internal design review, the changes had been easy to ignore at a distance. A stiffness in his gait, a slight tremor when he'd reach for a glass of water. Now, with only a few meters between them, the degeneration was impossible to miss. Elias's frame seemed to have been narrowed, as if someone had taken his familiar silhouette and compressed it from the sides. His shoulders, once sharp and straight under black turtlenecks and tailored jackets, had rounded inward. Tendons stood out along his neck when he moved his head. The pale Californian Asian skin of his face was drawn tight around cheekbones that cast deeper shadows than before. What caught Marcus most, though, was the way he walked. Not like an old man exactly. There was no shuffle, no stumbling. Instead, there was a careful deliberateness, each step placed with micro-adjustments that Marcus recognized, with a small jolt from rehab centers he'd toured with venture philanthropists. Patients with neurological disorders learning to negotiate gravity all over again. Bodies negotiating with themselves. Still, Elias had dressed as if nothing had changed. Black turtleneck, charcoal blazer, dark jeans, minimalist sneakers. The uniform he'd engineered years ago to brand himself as the architect of tomorrow. On screen, the outfit still worked. In person, it had started to look like armor. Elias, Marcus forced warmth into his tone. You look, don't lie, Elias said, but he smiled as he crossed the room. Not up here. His eyes were unchanged. That, Marcus thought, was the most unnerving part. Even as the body failed, those pale, almost colorless irises, gray with a faint green undertone that AR filters always punched up for broadcast, remained needle-sharp. They pinned, measured, evaluated. They registered Marcus's hesitation, his calculation, his tiny fractional flinch at the sight of the cane. The cane was sleek, matte white, its shaft apparently featureless until Marcus's lenses picked up the faint shimmer of embedded sensors. Even that disease had been given the Synapse treatment. Glossy, minimal, monetizable. Elias made it halfway to the window before a tremor rippled through his right leg. It was small, more an interruption than a collapse, but it was enough to send a jolt of instability through his frame. His hand tightened on the cane, knuckles whitening. Marcus stepped forward automatically. Let me... Elias's left hand flicked up, stopping him without touch. I'm fine. The words weren't defiant, just factual. Elias had never indulged in self-pity, at least not in public. He waited, feeling the misfire in his own neurons like an electric storm passing. Marcus could almost see him writing it out, internally tagging the sensation, filing it with 1,000 other data points. He'd once compared his own mind to a mapping engine. We're always building terrain models of our lives, Elias had said in a panel discussion years ago, back when the disease was a rumor, and the only thing fragile about him was his patience for bad interface design. Most people's maps are low resolution, blurry. My job is to make the map as high-res as possible so I can navigate better than anyone else. Now he was watching his own map blur at the edges. When the tremor subsided, Elias resumed his slow, precise pace until he reached the window beside Marcus. They stood side by side, 30 centimeters apart, looking out over the staggered grid of towers and light. For a moment, neither spoke. Marcus knew better than to rush him. One of the reasons their partnership had worked, if that was the word for it, was that he'd learned the rhythm of Elias's silences. Some were simple processing delays, the pauses of an introvert forced into constant conversation. Others were tactical, lures to make the other person fill the space, reveal themselves. This felt different. The quiet held an awareness of ending. You know what I hate about this view? Elias said finally. Marcus blinked. You designed it. I designed the room, Elias corrected. The view is a side effect. He lifted his left hand, the one not gripping the cane, and traced a line down the glass. Tiny capacitive sensors embedded in the panel's inner layer woke in response. Marcus's AR overlay flashed a translucent vertical axis, reading out atmospheric particulate density, humidity, temperature. At this altitude, you get a false sense of clarity, Elias said. You look down and think, I can see everything. I can see the system, but you're only seeing one layer. All the chaos is in the overlaps. Marcus tilted his head. The lower levels of city flickered with icons as his lenses responded to the gesture. Synapse AR streams, competitor overlays, civic network bands. As always, the Synapse layer dominated, painted in cool whites and soft blues. Looks orderly from here, Marcus said. Our engagement metrics agree. That's the trick. Elias's fingertip brushed a cluster of towers in the financial 3 district. Order is just what happens when enough variables cancel each other out. Statistical calm. Underneath, people are thrashing. Thrashing pays the bills, Marcus said lightly. They want relief. We provide it. It's a good business. It's too small, Elias said. The words were quiet, but they landed like a marker placed on a mental board. Marcus's jaw tightened. Over the last decade, they'd had this argument in a dozen configurations. It always came back to the gap between Elias's idea of the way, his quasi-mystical term for whatever harmony he wanted to architect, and Marcus's blunt devotion to margins, penetration, churn. He glanced sideways. You didn't ask me up here to talk about product philosophy? No, Elias said. We're past philosophy. He turned from the window with a slow pivot, leaning more on the cane. Motion tracking algorithms in Marcus's lenses highlighted the subtle drag in his right side, then politely suppressed the visualization when he didn't request analytics. Sit, Elias said. Marcus hesitated a fraction of a second. The chairs were near the center of the room, facing a slender hearth, a narrow slit in the floor emitting a ribbon of programmable flame behind sound-damping nanoglass. Pure theater. Elias almost never turned it on. Tonight the slit was lit. A low, steady line of flame burned along the ground between the chairs, its color shifting almost imperceptibly from warm orange to pale blue. Heat drifted upward in a gentle, controlled exhale. Fire, Marcus thought. Tamed and horizontal, purely for aesthetic effect. He sat, letting the chair recognize his weight and adjust its contour. Elias lowered himself into the opposing chair, with care that seemed more deliberate than slow, as if every movement were being recorded for later analysis. For a moment, all Marcus heard was the soft hiss of the hidden environmental system and the near-silent combustion of methane along the hearth slit. Then Elias said, They tell me 18 months. Marcus's brain tuned to valuations and forecasts, translated reflexively. Runway, not lifespan. Then the context snapped into place. He stared. 18... On the generous end, Elias said, 18 months of functional capacity. He flexed his right hand, and for an instant the tremor returned, fingers jerking in a staccato that looked nothing like the smooth gestures he used in keynotes. He set the hand deliberately on the armrest, pinning it in place. You told the board, Marcus began. I told them what was useful to tell them, Elias said. Optimistic projections, contingency plans, inspirational bullshit. That's their language, but we're not in a board meeting. Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar rise of irritation and something sharper under it, fear. Have you considered that maybe the board deserved to know the real timelines? He asked. That shareholders deserve exactly as much truth as keeps the stock stable, Elias said. You taught me that, Marcus. It was true enough that Marcus couldn't deny it without choking. He looked at his hands. They were steady. A faint sheen of sweat had formed between his thumb and index finger, where they pressed against each other. In that time, Synapse would ship 2 major OS cycles, 3 minor hardware revisions, at least 1 new product line if Marcus's roadmap held. They had regulatory hearings coming in the EU cluster, an antitrust negotiation in India, and a delicate partnership dance with the Pacific Alliance. Media depended on the fiction of Elias as eternal, the ascetic genius whose body might fail, but slowly, gracefully, in a way that allowed for maximum documentary footage and a perfectly timed handoff to some anointed successor. 18 months shredded that narrative. You're sure? Marcus asked, because that was what you said. There's always something, Elias cut in. Experimental nano-repair vectors, personalized gene vector cocktails, cryonic fantasies. The problem isn't lack of options, it's the ratio of time to noise. I could spend 18 months fighting to get 18 more, or I could spend 18 building the thing we'll both be remembered for. He reached into his blazer. For a heartbeat, the motion triggered an old vestigial fight-flight spike in Marcus's nervous system. Men reaching into jackets in high-level meetings had, historically, produced both pens and pistols. The world of 2049 was less tactilely violent, but memory ran deep in the species. Elias withdrew something that gleamed in the firelight. At first, Marcus thought it was a piece of jewelry. A pendant, maybe. A thin lozenge of polished obsidian, no larger than his thumb, its surface so dark it seemed to drink the surrounding light. A single thin seam ran around its edge, so tight it was nearly invisible. There were no ports, no visible contacts, no branding. Even here, in a room built on ostentatious understatement, the object radiated intent. "What is that?" Marcus asked, though a part of his mind already knew. The rumors had been circulating in layers of polite gossip and leaked technical specs for months. Project Nirvana, Elias's latest obsession. A wordless, near-religious hush seemed to accompany every mention. Elias rolled the thing between thumb and forefinger, holding it up so that the firelight skated across its surface and broke into tiny prismatic glints. "This," he said, "is me." "The neural map," Marcus said. "Version 3.7, Elias said. "They wanted to call it a soul drive, but that sounded like something marketing would slap on a USB stick at a trade show. I prefer precise language." Marcus leaned forward despite himself. He'd seen conceptual diagrams, architecture flows, volumetric renderings of brain tissue, color-coded clusters of synaptic weights, layered on in shimmering fractal complexity. He'd sat in investor briefings while Miraquan and her team sketched out the process in sanitized metaphors, identifying patterns of patterns, building a higher dimensional manifold of preferences, memories, associative chains. But this was the first time he'd seen the physical vessel meant to carry all of that. "You really finished it," he said. "I thought that I was stalling." Elias smiled faintly. "I was. I wanted it to be perfect. It isn't. But it's enough." Marcus thought of the early prototypes, glitchy, half-there constructs with patchwork personalities built from scraped social feeds and biometric logs from willing beta testers. He thought of the fiasco 3 years ago, when a rival firm had claimed to resurrect a dead pop star as a full-stack consciousness artifact, only for the simulacrum to start splicing ad jingles into its own lyrics mid-performance. "We've had personality engines for a decade," he said. "You were always the one saying it was unethical to pretend they were people." "Pretend is the key word." Elias turned the drive in his hand, almost absently. "Project Nirvana isn't a performance. It's a structural capture. Not perfect, but continuous." "Continuous," Marcus repeated, "as in, you go to sleep biological and wake up synthetic." "That's the intention," Elias said. "A continuity of subjective experience. No gap." He looked up, and for the first time that evening, Marcus saw something uncompromised by poise in his gaze. Hunger. "You're going through with it," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "I'm booked for upload at the Andes site in 6 days, Elias said. "We start pre-integration tomorrow. I'll be wheels up by the end of the week." The words dropped into the room like small, heavy stones. The Andes facility. Even the board had only seen it in abstract renderings, a constellation of matte white domes and pylons clinging to a high-altitude plateau above most atmospheric interference. A place where the air was thin and clean enough for quantum arrays to maintain delicate entanglement states with minimal noise. A temple of computation built into the bones of the world. "You're just leaving," Marcus said slowly, "in the middle of all this." "All this?" Elias's gaze flicked past him, through the glass to the city. "This is groundwork. We've been in beta for 10 years, Marcus. Constant iteration, constant compromise. AR, haptics, behavioral scaffolding, they're all prosthetics, training wheels. The next version doesn't need wheels." He tapped the soul drive lightly with a fingernail. The obsidian surface emitted a faint, pearlescent ripple, confirming its active state for anyone with the right lenses. Marcus's HUD tagged it, pulling in encrypted metadata. Project Nirvana Core /instance. Thorne primary /status, locked. "You're assuming," Marcus said carefully, "that the upload works." "It will work," Elias said. "You told me once that certainty is an engineering failure," Marcus countered. "If you're sure, it's because you're missing variables." Elias's smile was quick, almost pleased. "And you told me once that risk is just mispriced opportunity. Here we are. Both hypocrites. He set the drive on the narrow glass table between them with a small, precise motion, aligning it exactly with the table's center line. The obsidian lozenge looked absurdly simple resting there, a black hyphen in a white paragraph. Biology was never the endgame, Elias said. We've always known that. The brain is legacy hardware, wet, messy, fault-prone, version 1.0. We've spent decades patching around it, nootropics, implants, mindfulness apps flavored like candy. This is the clean break. Marcus stared at the drive. The board is going to lose its mind, he said. You're talking about removing yourself from the human leadership stack and putting your consciousness into a prototype chassis in a hidden facility off any known redundancy grid. From a governance standpoint, it's insane. From a governance standpoint, Elias said, what we're doing now is insane. A trillion-credit entity anchored to a failing nervous system. Investors fetishize continuity, but what they really fear is uncertainty. Upload removes ambiguity. I will be precisely what I am now, minus tremors, minus misfiring motor neurons, minus the constant drag of entropy. That's the pitch, Marcus said. His mind was already fracturing the scenario into segments. Internal messaging, external comms, legal. But you know perception is everything. The media will eat this alive. Tech Messiah uploads himself to robot body. Half the planet will call it blasphemy, the other half will call it a stunt. The half that calls it a stunt will still buy what we're selling, Elias said. Controversy is just free bandwidth. Unless it tanks the stock, Marcus said. Unless regulators decide you've crossed some ethical line we didn't know existed last quarter. You can't make a move this big without a control narrative, and you can't direct that narrative if you're offline in a lab in the Andes with your brain peeled into qubits. Elias watched him with that disconcerting stillness he used when focus, not muscle, was the scarce resource. That, he said, is why you're here. Marcus's pulse ticked up. I'm interim CEO, he said. Not a regent in a sci-fi monarchy. The board gave me temporary authority in your absence. What you're proposing, it's a power vacuum disguised as transcendence. For you, Elias said mildly, it's the opportunity of your life. Marcus laughed, a sharp exhale. You're serious. Of course. Elias's tone was almost gentle. You've wanted a freer hand for years. If only Elias would stop polishing and start shipping. Remember? He did. He remembered saying it drunk at a conference bar in Singapore to a VC who'd repeated it to a journalist as an anonymous quote. He remembered the small, icy conversation with Elias afterward, the tightening of trust. You brought me in, Marcus said, because you needed someone who understood capital, scale, velocity. I've done that. We've gone from a boutique interface company to the spine of the world's attention economy. But that worked because there was you, the visionary, the story. I'm not. He broke off, watching Elias's expression. You know I'm not you. Good, Elias said. The world doesn't need another me. It needs the thing after me. And you're not here to replace what I am. You're here to shepherd what comes next. Easy for you to say from your quantum cathedral, Marcus said. Down here there are contingencies. He thought of Helena Park, hair pulled into a tight silver knot, eyes like glass beads under perfectly shaped brows. Helena on the boardroom's far side of the long onyx table, fingers tapping metrics into shape. Helena, who'd once told him in a private quarter, "We love your aggression, Marcus, as long as it's properly leashed." She will try to stall this, he said, or bury it in committees until your 18 months are up. That's why she doesn't know my real timeline, Elias said, and why you will have something she doesn't. His gaze flicked to the soul drive, then back to Marcus. In the event of my physical death prior to full integration, Elias said, this becomes the controlling interest in Synapse. Marcus's eyebrows rose. That's not how ownership works, Elias. The drive isn't... I'm not talking about equity, Elias said. I'm talking about narrative control. You know as well as I do that whoever speaks for me after I'm gone will define how the world understands what I meant. This drive is my voice, my patterns, my legitimacy. If my body fails before we complete the process, you'll be the one holding that legitimacy. The air between them seemed to sharpen. You're serious, Marcus said slowly. You'd trust me with... I'm not sure trust is the right word. Elias's smile flashed, quick and wry. We're past sentiment, remember? It's strategy. You want to preserve Synapse. I want to preserve my work. Those goals are aligned. Give the board a ghost of me they can believe in, and they'll let you do what needs doing. Marcus's gaze had drifted, without permission, to the drive again. At rest, it was a simple object, but in his mind's eye, he saw it lit by lab LEDs, hovering in the center of some sterile chamber, while arrays of sensors probed its surface. He saw code streams, probability matrices, neural graphs. He saw the art of war. The thought arrived so suddenly, so completely, that it made his breath catch. For years, he'd maintained something they jokingly called the War Room, a private modeling engine layered in air-gapped servers 3 levels below public space. Officially, it was a competitive analysis tool built on classical game theory and market response simulations. In reality, it was his pet project, a recursive strategy core built from millions of annotated scenarios and seeded with a text he'd learned to love in college for its ruthless simplicity. Sun Tzu's The Art of War. He'd built a protocol around it. The Art of War protocol, all caps in the system, as a kind of philosophical kernel. Every input, every possible move in a simulated market conflict passed through that set of axioms. All warfare is based on deception. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. He had always thought of it as a toy, a dangerous toy perhaps, but bounded, a model in which he could test his hungers without consequence. Now, staring at the obsidian lozenge that Elias claimed held the essence of himself, Marcus saw a convergence. What if the ghost of Elias, his voice, his patterns, his precious aesthetic sensibility, could be sharpened? What exactly is on that drive? He asked. Elias watched him, as if he could see the arc of Marcus's thoughts unfolding. A snapshot, he said, not of molecules but of relationships, long-term potentiation patterns, association weights, reinforcement pathways. We map not just what I remember but how my mind moves when prompted. Hundreds of hours of interrogation under every mood state we could safely induce. It's not a static database. It's an engine configured like me. Emotion? Marcus asked. To an extent, Elias said. Valence tags, sensory salience markers, aesthetic preference matrices, anger, joy, disgust, curiosity, not hormones but their shadows. Ethics? Marcus said, then immediately regretted making it sound abstract. Elias's mouth quirked. We didn't hard code a conscience, if that's what you're asking. We mapped my decision history. Value gradients inferred from past choices. You'll get my tendencies, my hesitations. Marcus heard the unspoken critique in his own thought. In meeting after meeting, he'd watched Elias stall when they could have moved. He'd watched him slash features that were perfectly viable because they didn't fit some platonic vision of grace. He'd watched competitor charts creep upward while Synapse paused to adjust a bevel radius or tune a notification tone. I don't intend to hesitate in synthetic form, Elias said, as if he'd plucked the thought directly from Marcus's skull. The drag you've seen in me these last few years is contextual. Pain, fatigue, the continuous background process of decaying. Imagine a version of me without that overhead. Imagine a version of you with instincts, Marcus said before he could stop himself, not just taste. Elias's eyebrows lifted, amused. Is that what you think I lack? Sometimes, Marcus said bluntly, markets move faster than epiphanies. And yet, Elias said, glancing around the room, here we are. In your metrics, are we failing? Marcus bit back his immediate response. By any conventional measure, revenue, valuation, ubiquity, Synapse was a dominant superstructure. Their AR layer rode atop governments and telecoms. Their haptic bands and neural sympathetic wearables wrapped wrists from Lagos to Lima. You could live without a bank, without a country, and still survive. Living without Synapse's OS had become, in much of the world, an act of deliberate, costly refusal. He had helped build that. He was proud of it. And yet, "You know the curve could be steeper," he said quietly. "You know there are markets we've let others capture because you were playing monk in your glass dojo." Elias's gaze hardened very slightly, the way it did when a subordinate's point was both true and irrelevant. "After upload," he said, "I will have cycles to address every market, every opportunity. No more fatigue, no more fragility. That's why this is necessary. I won't be bound by this body's failures." "And until then?" Marcus asked. 6 days to tell the world their favorite architect of tomorrow is about to unplug himself and hope they don't revolt?" Elias's lips curved. "We'll stage it. A farewell tour. A narrative arc. I've already recorded several addresses for staggered release. You'll manage the rollouts." Marcus's HUD, which he'd suppressed earlier, pulsed gently at the edge of his vision, as if on cue. A new item had appeared. Nirvana comms, package VI 1.0. Access, limited, Thorne plus Vane. "You planned this without telling me," Marcus said. "I planned it before I knew I'd have to accelerate," Elias said. "The storm in my head is moving faster than forecast. There's always weather we don't model." His right hand twitched again in punctuation. The fire along the floor whispered. "What do you want from me?" Marcus said. "Two things," Elias said. "First, you carry this." He nodded at the soul drive. "If my heart stops before the Andes, before integration, you become its steward. You'll work with Mira to complete the upload in my absence. No board votes, no committees. Consider it my last directive." "And the second?" Marcus asked. Elias leaned back, the chair adjusting support profiles around his altered posture. For a moment, he looked almost at ease. "The second," he said, "is that you decide what kind of future you're building me into." Marcus frowned. "Clarify." "You've always wanted a bolder synapse," Elias said. "Less meditation, more movement. When I come back—" "If," Marcus said. "When," Elias repeated, not flinching. "When I come back in synthetic form, I will be optimized for my current goal state, which is, and always has been, to reduce friction in human experience, to remove the unnecessary suffering that comes from bad design." Marcus almost laughed. "You're dying and your North Star is still UX." "Design isn't surface," Elias said. "It's structure, behavior. When doors open before you need them to, when systems anticipate instead of react, that's grace. That's the way. A world without stupid obstacles, without friction." "Friction is where the money is," Marcus said. "People pay to have it sanded down." "Exactly," Elias said. "You see the revenue, I see the relief. Together we can scale both." He inclined his head slightly. "But there's a danger," he added. "Frictionless systems can flatten what makes us human. Remove more than just inconvenience. I recall you saying once that most people don't know what they want until you show it to them," Marcus said. "Isn't that flattening?" "It's curating," Elias said. "Gently editing the chaos. I have instincts, Marcus. Lines I won't cross. There are things I don't want to sacrifice in the name of stability." Marcus thought of his war room, of scenario after scenario where the cleanest win involved shadow campaigns, information choke points, subtle undermining of competitors so their customers drifted, willingly, into Synapse's embrace. He thought of all the times he'd presented toned-down versions of those strategies, only to watch Elias pare them back further. "You made me soft," he thought, not for the first time. Not soft enough to be ethical, just soft enough to be inefficient. "When I come back," Elias said quietly, "I need you to have shaped the terrain. If you want a synapse that takes bolder steps, that treats the world less like a tea ceremony and more like a campaign, then you'll have your window while I'm offline. But remember, whatever world you build is the one I'll wake into. Those will be the constraints I learn in." Marcus's throat was dry. He swallowed. "You're asking me to decide what kind of god you become," he said. "Don't be melodramatic," Elias said. But there was no amusement in it now, only exhaustion, tightly wrapped. "Gods have worshippers. I'll have users." "Same thing," Marcus murmured. Elias regarded him for a long moment. Promise me you'll protect the core, he said. The part of me that still cares about beauty, about meaning. Don't turn me into a CFO. Marcus snorted. I'd never inflict that on you. Good, Elias said. Then we understand each other. They sat in silence as the city continued its restless, algorithmic shifting below. After a time, an automated service drone, matte white, hovering on whispering impellers, drifted in from a side alcove, bearing 2 glasses on a minimal tray. It deposited them on the table with a soft chime and retreated. Marcus picked up his glass. The liquid was a pale amber, single malt from some resurrected Scottish microclimate, knowing Elias. He sipped. Smoke, salt, a thin blade of peat. You should know, Elias said, that Mira has reservations. Mira has ethics, Marcus said. It's part of her charm. She's concerned about identity continuity, Elias said. About what gets lost in translation. About whether the mapped me will feel like me. And what do you think? Marcus asked. Elias looked at the drive again. For the first time, Marcus saw something like fear flicker across his face. Not of death, but of being wrong. I think consciousness is a pattern that pretends to be a point, Elias said slowly. We're already edited by our bodies every day. Hormones, circadian rhythms, glitches. This is just another filter. A better one if we've done our work. If, Marcus repeated. If, Elias agreed softly. There's always an if. They finished their drinks without speaking much. The fire along the floor sank, embering down in response to some unseen thermostat. Outside, the last of the sun bled into a deep, polluted indigo. At last, Elias pushed himself up from the chair. Standing looked harder than sitting had. His right leg shook once before locking. He waited, eyes half-lidded, until the misfire passed. Then he straightened and reached for the cane. Time, Marcus thought, had been given a new measurable unit, the interval between those tremors. I have prep protocols in the morning, Elias said. Blood work, scaffolding, mundane rituals. I wanted to talk before the noise started. You call this quiet? Marcus said. Quieter than the Andes, Elias said. Up there, everything hums. He moved toward the elevator, walking with that same precise care. Halfway across the room, he paused and looked back. I'm trusting you, he said. Marcus opened his mouth to deflect, to turn it into a joke, but Elias's gaze held him. Don't make me a liar, Elias added. Marcus stood. You're leaving me with an impossible task, he said. Step into the light, reassure the board, keep the stock from cratering, and maybe, if you die on the way, figure out how to resurrect you without losing either your humanity or our competitive edge. Elias's smile this time was something like genuine pleasure. You excel at impossible tasks. That's why I keep you around. Kept, Marcus said. We're not done, Elias said. We're just branching. See you on the other side. The elevator doors whispered open. Elias stepped inside. For a heartbeat standing framed by the gleaming metal and glass, cane in hand, shoulders narrow but head high, he looked almost like a figure in a painting, some late Renaissance martyr for the Church of Technology. The doors slid shut, cutting the image cleanly in half and then to nothing. Silence folded back into the room. Marcus remained where he was, listening to the faint diminishing whir of the elevator's descent. Hums overlapped in his hearing, the environmental system, the subtle vibration of distant turbines, the imagined buzzing of Elias's failing neurons. After a time, he turned back toward the chairs. The soul drive sat exactly where Elias had left it, a small black shape against the pale tabletop, reflecting nothing. He approached it slowly as if it might bolt. When he was close enough, his lenses picked up its encrypted beacon again. He saw the tags, the hashes, the security layers. He saw the countless person-hours and cognitive cycles that had poured into creating the thing, now weighing no more than a few grams. He thought of market floors around the world, of investors and regulators and users waiting hungrily for the next cue from the man this drive purported to contain. He thought of his war room. His hand hovered over the lozenge. For a moment he did nothing. Habits of caution, of respect for the myth of Elias, held his fingers in check. Then he closed them around the drive. It was cool to the touch. He half expected a tingle, some theatrical interface effect, but it remained stubbornly inert. Perfect, minimal, silent. A line from Sun Tzu unspooled in his memory, as familiar to him as any childhood story. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. The chaos was coming. Elias had just lit the fuse with a calm confession and a departure date. Upload. Andes. 18 months, if that. The board would panic. The markets would thrash. Regulators would circle like sharks, scenting electrolytes in the water. Opportunity sat in his palm. He could, if Elias died en route or on the slab, hand this pristine, contemplative ghost back to the world unaltered. He could let an unmodified Elias 1.0, slow, aesthetic, hesitant, inhabit the company again in synthetic form. He could anchor Synapse's future in the same careful, incremental philosophy that had brought them here. Or he could refine it, not obliterate, not overwrite. He wasn't suicidal. The charisma, the brand, the way Elias made people believe, those were priceless assets. But assets could be leveraged. Subroutines could be wrapped. He imagined the composite, Elias's voice and aesthetic sense, guided not by vague notions of the way, but by the honed clarity of strategic doctrine. A mind that still thought of friction as a design problem, but one that also understood that, in war, friction was the enemy. A leader who would interpret markets as battlefields and human hesitation as terrain to be shaped. He tucked the drive into an inner pocket of his jacket. The fabric recognized the object and sealed a micro-closure around it, adding its presence to the suit's inventory. For a moment, with that small weight against his chest, Marcus felt an unfamiliar sensation. Not guilt. He'd made peace long ago with the moral compromises of hypergrowth, but something adjacent. He walked to the far end of the penthouse where a narrow, almost invisible door was embedded in the wall. No handle, just a faint indentation. He placed his palm flat against it. Heat pattern. The door read his prints, his capillary mapping, the subtle tremor of his heartbeat. Vane, Marcus, he said. Sub-level access. War room. There was a soft click, like a tongue lifted from the roof of a mouth. The seam opened, revealing a dark stairwell descending into the spine of the tower, away from glass and sunset and curated flame. Behind him, the city glittered under a deepening, smog-tinted night. Somewhere below, elevators carried Elias Thorne toward waiting labs and pre-integration rituals, toward a private jet that would climb through turbulent layers of atmosphere, toward a high-altitude facility carved into Andean stone. Marcus stood at the threshold between light and shadow, his hands still resting on the doorframe, the drive a cool certainty against his heart, and considered the board's spreadsheets and Helena's scowl and Mira's quiet, troubled eyes. He thought of the war room's silent banks of processors, the patient algorithms built on ancient warverse, waiting without desire for new inputs. All warfare is based on deception, he murmured. His voice sounded different in the little wedge of darkness. Closer, less performative. He stepped forward into the stairwell, letting the door whisper shut behind him. Above, the glass monolith reflected the last traces of twilight, indifferent. Far away to the east, beyond the curve of the world and the reach of his vision, high-altitude winds sheared against mountain ridges in the Andes, setting the thin air trembling around a hidden facility that would soon receive the frail body of a man and the obsidian seat of his mind. By the time Elias's jet lifted off, Marcus Vane intended to have made a decision no one else would see coming. Down below in the dark of his private sublevel, the war room waited.